Okay, so we should be live at the moment. Welcome to this Finland Azure User Group Virtual Azure Tips and Tricks event. And without further ado, let's go forward. So, Finland Azure User Group, obviously for Finland and about Azure. It's a community by users and partners, founded in 2013, and we are already around 1,600 members. We normally organize around 10 events yearly, live meetups and bigger events like IgluConf and PolarConf, but unfortunately we can't do that. So for now we have this virtual events, and these are several talks on different topics, each around 20 to 40 minutes. You can find them on the FAUG meetup site, on the community side, in YouTube if you search Finland Azure User Group. And obviously this is my presentation. The next one is in a couple of weeks time, and that's in a couple of weeks time because Ignite is happening next week. So Ignite this year is virtual, available to everybody. Check out the registration either using the QR code or link above. And so that was the shout out to our sponsor. So, and on to this week's topic. So I'll be talking about Azure governance tools and how to make them work for you. And if we go and look at them, firstly, I'll introduce myself. So obviously, Antti Arnell, I'm Chief Architect and Azure Lead at Cybercon Group. So this is basically what I do for work. I do advisory work. I tell customers how to properly use the cloud, how to do governance work and such. And a quick recap. What is cloud governance and why do you need it? And we all have seen this traditional approach to doing IT. This is how we've done IT in the normal world for ages. And it's not really properly working in the cloud area. If you have developers and operations wanting to do something quickly, operate, that's the promise we've been told that, okay, you can do so much more quicker, faster, easier. If we have some cloud engineers responsible for the environment stopping you every time you want to do something, it's not going to work. So from there on, we can go and look at the cloud native governance. And these are the tools that I'll be talking about. Once you have these in place, hopefully you have a proper environment where the cloud engineers only have to monitor and look at the stuff happening in the cloud, and developers and operations can go on and work their magic, make good solutions and programs without slowing them, and still everybody knows we are doing everything securely. And I forgot to note that there's a chat in there, so if anybody can want to ask any questions, I'll monitor that also and try to answer the questions if you have any. But after the recap, let's talk about the governance tools in Azure. So what's available there? So these are all cloud native, Azure native tools available to you. We have management groups, and this is the hierarchy. This is how you define your organization in Azure. You make it look like your organization, and you place your solutions into those. Next up, we have policies, and policies are just for control. You can do real-time enforcements of those policies. You can look at how compliant your solutions are to those, and you can do remediation for those. Blueprints are then the landing zones for the environment. You deploy and update your cloud environments in a repeatable manner, and specific components you want to use for those. And then the next two ones are not so much of of control tools, but for the visualization. So you have resource graph to see what you have there, the query, the explore, and analyze that. And you have the cost management tools to monitor cloud spend, optimize your resourcing. I won't be talking about cost management today, but I'll quickly show you why you should be using resource graph. But to look at all of these a bit more in depth, we have the Azure management groups. So, okay, these are they should be used to make the environment easy to control. So what you can do is you make a logical grouping of your subscriptions based on how your environment is set up or your organization is set up, just to mirror that. I'll show you an example later on, but this makes it so much easier to provision, control, policies, and access to all of you different parts of your organization once it's starting to grow and sprawl. Management groups also have inheritance, so it's basically a tree. So when you put something on the root level, that's inherited by child, and if you have, let's say for example, you have an IT under IT department, you have maybe a separate IT department for cloud or something else. Those inherit everything from the steps up. And the hierarchy is quite flexible to do. It can be updated quickly. I'll talk about that later on, how to do that, or whether it's easier. But you can easily scale up and down on what you do. You can create more of them easily. And as I said, you apply governance controls and policies and access controls to those. So for example, you can have ARM policies, ARM templates to have having those, or as I said, blueprints, policies, and security center setups, and resource control, access controls. Next tool is in fact the Azure Policy, and as I said, it's for enforcement and compliance. So you can turn on, there are plenty of built-in policies in there, or you can build your own policies for if those are enough. But those are the policies that control what can happen there. I'll show an example, a couple of them later on. But with these policies, you can do real-time policy evaluation and enforcement. You can do periodic on-demand compliance evaluation. And what's really cool about them is once you go into a hybrid world, you can have VM in-guest policy controls, but also Arc. If you use Arc to control something in your own premises, your Kubernetes clusters or virtual machines on premises, or even in AWS or Google Cloud, you can have policies for those. And you can apply them at scale. So as I said, when you add them into the management groups, you can quickly and fastly add these guardrails to all of your organization. And as I said, remediation is available for them, real-time remediation, or even if you add them later on, it can look at what's been done before and maybe then fix those. And really cool thing about these is Azure Policies works with Azure DevOps. So if Azure DevOps is your chosen tool for CI/CD pipeline, it's built in there. So your pipelines and builds will check with Azure Policies if they're compliant. And so you can also, before you even set anything up, to have the right security guardrails, monitoring setup, and such. And what's really cool is also with Azure Policies, if you there's a GitHub action, for example, for Azure Policy compliance scan, and so that can check your workflow compliance, but also generate a report on for your state when you do that through a pipeline. Azure Blueprints. So these are the enterprise landing zone controls where you set up and deploy environments in a repeatable manner. So blueprints, which is shown here in the middle, have something in them, and those are normally role-based access controls on what permissions everybody has on them, policy definitions, which I talked about previously, or even ARM templates. So you can set up, let's say, networking, storage for monitoring, whatever, anything that you can do with ARM templates, you can set up. If you put those in blueprints, they'll be set up in the subscription that the blueprint is applied to through the management group. Yeah, and so resource graph, as I said, this is for more of on the side of knowing what's going on. So querying, exploring, and analyzing what is happening in the environment. So you can do really fast queries. I'll show you why they're fast, and you can then do them on scale and find out how to fastly find what you have in the setup in your environment. So we have a question here that says, how easy is it to implement and deploy out your own Azure policy if we do not want to use existing ones? Well, it depends. If you're good at coding, it's not that difficult. And there's plenty of actually examples of people, what they've done before. So the built-in policies are, I'll get to those later on, what kind of policies there are. I think for most of the basic cases, those would be enough for most of the time. But as I said, the custom policies are not that difficult. You just have to know a bit of the language to code for them. And I'll talk about actually doing them by code later on. But yeah, so this is pulling all of that together in a way that you might understand how they work. So everything in Azure is controlled by the Azure Resource Management. So even if you go into Azure Policy, Azure Portal, and you check on what you have in your environment, in your subscriptions, the queries and the commands you do and you utilize go through the Azure Resource Manager to all the resource providers. You can see on the bottom you have virtual machine, resource provider, storage, network, such resource providers. So everything goes through the Azure Resource Manager. And Policy Engine sits on top of that, so that monitors on the Azure Resource Manager what's been changed, what's happened, and from there on it gets all of the information to you, either in the portal or through as I said, other reports. Azure Blueprints sits on the side, as I said, also, and through them they also control, again, the Azure Resource Manager, and also control the settings and policy engines, then what you have there. And the query, what happens is I'll talk about later why the Azure Resource Graph queries are so fast compared to using Azure Portal or CLI is shown in later on. So from there we go on, how do we make these work for us really in this world? And I know there's a lot of people, because of the pictures I showed you, why we should have these. So as I said, people think when we talk about governance and control, we actually think about the first picture I showed you. There's somebody stopping you, or the developers or the operations, from doing anything into the cloud, when in fact these tools are, the point of them is the opposite. They should be helping you to do everything better. And the reasons you have to take these tools into account and have the tools is because a lot of the time, I mean, we as IT professionals want to do whatever we want. We don't want to be accountable for everybody or anybody. But then again, somebody has to answer for what's happening in the cloud, and there are issues we have to address. For example, the billing is too high. That cost that we get from the high billing, there's no way to associate that somewhere. We don't have any kind of audit trail, so we don't see what's happening, where, why, who's done what. There's data outside of what's allowed, for example, if that's very big. Quite often when you talk about companies in Finland, they say, okay, can we have our solutions, or can we have our data somewhere else except in Finland? Okay, you can have that in EU because of GDPR, but okay, so how do we control that our data doesn't escape to the United States or Asia or whatever? Or we have unsecured personal data, or just access control problems. And so these tools are really there to help you and everybody in your organization, and these are also made to protect from you and everybody from silly mistakes. And before I go into how these can be used and should be used, I'll just throw in a bit of an image of an ideal situation for development. And this is just to maybe provoke some reactions in somebody, in where an ideal situation where you develop something or do something, and it doesn't matter if you're developing just serverless application, new serverless application, or if you are using IaaS solutions, virtual machines with your old environment. The real way to do anything is you should use Azure Portal or and other tools just for read only, and everything should be done automatically, because once you do everything automatically, everything is repeatable, everything is checked. You can have pipelines where you have checks built in, security. So you should really have everything in your source control. You have the control plane, control with governance. So this would be the Azure environment, the Azure DevOps, or whatever tools you use to provision anything into Azure, whether it be CLI or PowerShell. That should be controlled with governance. And from there, you provision the services, and then you modify the services. And a lot of people say, well, this is not possible. We can't do this. We need permissions for this. There's this exception. And I just want to throw this out there as a challenge, that if you do everything properly and use these tools properly, I think this could be a possible scenario in which you can do everything. So basically, if you get a new person into your company, all you should actually give them is an access to Azure DevOps, and say, okay, go from there. That's everything you need. You don't need to do any other tools, for example. But okay, so how to use these then? Applying governance on different levels. So here we have a small example of organizing management. So you have the root setup here. You have the main group of the root organization, where you have some baseline policies. So for example, you could have the policy of the region availabilities or setup. So you can't set up anything else except North Europe and West Europe, for example, in Finland. And then from there on, this is the most basic environment you have. Then you have production environment, and then you have pre-production. Obviously, you could have plenty, as I said, this scales up quite easy. So if you have different units, business units, you could have 10 business units, and underneath every one of those you could have production environment. Depends on quite how you want to do, but this is quite a lot, the basic environment, and this would suffice for quite a lot of your environment needs. And from there on, as I said, the policies are inherited. So if you have the baseline policies on the top, on the root level, and you have the production environment policies, you get those separate policies and in the inherited policies. And from here you could have prod policies and pre-prod policies. So for example, you could lock down prod heavily, so nothing is allowed to be modified there or as I said, you don't have any control in Azure Portal, for example, into the services. Okay, but in the pre-prod you could actually grant people the role-based access control to, for example, delete something or anything, if you wanted to do those. And from there on, you have different production and various subscriptions and pre-production subscriptions. Once the subscriptions are placed into, so anything above in those managed groups are inherited from those. So applying Azure policies, as I said, there are a lot of built-in policies. There are policies in regards to security center, guest configurations, as I said, guest is meaning virtual machines. So you can, for example, have a policy that monitors, do they have backups enabled, or do they have an antivirus software installed. You can have policies for NSGs, for example, to monitor that all of them have a block rule at the end. You can control security in your Kubernetes, managed Kubernetes, and also you can control policies that control your role-based access control, for example. And if you have to follow certain regulations, for example, there's a ton of those ready-made. For example, if you're in the banking environment and you work with payment control, card payment controls, you have, for example, PCI controls, compliance on those. So your environment will be compliant with the PCI DSS payment controls. And you can require tagging. You can add tagging and such. You can allow specific SQs of virtual machines and regions, for example. And in regards to these, is the best practice is to look at what drives your need. So do you want to control costs? Do you want to maintain security and whatnot? You create these initiatives, which are groups of policies, for example, and then you set them up and to see if they meet your requirements. I would say you could do what-if analysis and obviously always when you do put them into effect, just have them monitor, not remediate everything immediately, otherwise you'll have problems. Also, for example, if you put a policy on requiring tagging, I think most of the blades, if you set up something in resources in Azure, most of the blades nowadays have the tag blade enabled. But previously, for example, I remember a case where somebody enabled and enforced tagging on all resources, and you couldn't manually create virtual machines because there wasn't in the portal, there wasn't a way to add the tag while creating a virtual machine. So that led to a scenario where nobody could create them, so it had to be disabled. As I said, there's a link here, policy as code. You can definitely, and you should look at these to look at automating these as code. Right. So landing zone blueprints. There's if you go into Microsoft Azure documentation and look at the cloud adoption framework, which very good documentation, has a lot of the stuff I talk about, but they have a lot of examples on what you have available as blueprints. So there are a lot of basic blueprints with for example, policies set up in them, networking, identities, stuff to do with data storage, compute. So for example, a lot of examples on how to set up basic environments that already have everything you need to do, you need to provide there and set up already. So what you do is you start with the consistent infrastructure blueprints. You get those, see what happens, and change only what needs to be changed. They can be quite interesting to handle, and really these are good, but most of the times I don't see a lot of customers wanting to use these for not anything else except ready-made networking and ready-made identity setups. But these are very powerful. As I said, you can have an ARM template there. So anything an ARM template can do, it can be set up automatically. So next one, as I said, resource graph. This is more on knowing what's happening in there, but the reason to use Resource Graph is really to do with the scale issue, the performance issue. If you use Azure CLI or PowerShell and query the resource providers, if you look at if you query, for example, all of your virtual machines and anything that they have in them, the actual query actually asks all of the resource providers you set up there for all of the information. So that creates actually a lot of time between, or it takes a lot of time to respond to that query, because actually the resource provider's performance is actually really slow. There is throttling there, and if you go through cross-subscription, cross-tenant environment, all of these issues multiply quite easily. So with a resource graph, you can do a one call against a resource graph, and it asks the whole environment you have already set up. It asks what is there. So you can actually do quite good queries, and it supports analytics queries also, and change history, which is, I think it's the last bullet point there, but maybe one of the most important ones. Because if something has been broken, you want to know what's happened. So change history is very, very important and very powerful to find out what's happening. So actually, a summary on how to make this work for you in a real world environment, and this is something we've been doing, for example, quite a lot. So I have here on this side the configuration as code. So everything should be in Git. Let's start with that. Anything you do, any script, anything you have should be stored there. Okay, from there on, you can do whatever you want. You can use CLI, copy into your PowerShell script, whatever. But let's start with that. But what you can do is you can actually do a lot of automation through this, and you can create group structure. And now I said, yeah, you can do this automatically. Is it worth doing it? Well, that depends. As I said, you can. Microsoft says that your management groups can change a lot, and you can scale up and change them as much as your organization changes, which is a good thing. But should that be automated? Well, probably not. So what happens is, what you can do is you can create an Azure CLI script of your group structure, which you can store in Git. And then from there on, using CLI, or even if you wanted to use a pipeline, that's fine. You can do that, and then you can change that. The next step to this would be have policies. You set up policies, what you want to have. As I said, you can set up policy as code. So you have a pipeline creating the policy setups into the management groups. So after that, now after the second step, you have a certain structure in there. You have the security guidelines, and so after now you can set up your blueprints. Again, blueprints. These are a bit strange. To deploy blueprints, you must first create one in a portal. Then you have to export it. But once you've exported that blueprint, you can actually bring it into Azure DevOps and play around with it. You can then make changes and push those changes into your environment. And lastly, subscriptions. So deploy subscriptions as code. You can, with enterprise agreements, create subscriptions with PowerShells and CLI, and then with the CLI or PowerShell, you can move those into the specific managed group. Once you've done that, as I said, the subscription inherits everything you set up. It inherits everything from the root level to production level. All of those policies and all of those blueprints are set up there or automatically. So this, as I said, once done correctly, is very, very, very powerful tools available to you. And lastly, if you have more interest in this, check out in GitHub Azure under Azure and the enterprise scale. that has Microsoft Enterprise Scale Architecture, and those are there are a lot of examples of basically what I've talked to you about. There's a picture here that has, as I said, the root tenants, the different organization tenants, the production, the pre-production, and for example, examples on what you should have there in them. For example, if you have a connectivity subscriptions, how to set up virtual WAN or hub and spoke environments in those. If you have an identity, how to add monitoring, Azure Security Center in those. If you have a basic management or just even a normal production landing zone subscription, what you can set up in those. And these are very, very good examples of what's available there. But okay, right on time, half an hour. That's a quick look on all of that. There's a small lag here, so if you have any more questions, you can write them in the chat. I can answer them, or you can get hold of me. There's the MS Guru Slack for Finnish Microsoft tech people, so you can also catch me there if you want to. But yeah, that's basically everything I had on Azure governance tools. Thank you from my side. Hope this was really informative to you and you got something out of this, and see you around.